Monday morning, 8:47, 14th floor, Apex Dynamics headquarters, Chicago. Eleanor Harmon walked into the Technology Operations Center and saw a man asleep at his desk, not in a break room, not during an authorized rest period, but slumped over his keyboard in the center of the room. Screens still glowing around him, a cold cup of coffee sitting untouched at his elbow. She did not ask what had happened. She did not ask who he was or how long he had been there. As the newly appointed CEO of one of the most powerful technology companies in the Midwest, she had been in the role for exactly 72 hours, and she had already decided that the first thing any leader must establish is a standard. She made her decision in fewer than 30 seconds. She had no way of knowing it would become the most expensive decision of her career. What actually happened in the hours before that moment? And why would one man's sleep become the thing that brought down a billion-dollar empire? Apex Dynamics was not the kind of company that appeared in consumer advertisements or plastered its name across sports arenas. It operated from a glass and steel tower in the heart of Chicago's technology corridor, housing 12,000 employees across 6 divisions, and for nearly a decade it had built its reputation on a single principle: infrastructure that other industries depended on to function. Its code ran inside hospital networks, financial clearing systems, logistics platforms, and transportation grids across 31 states. The work was rarely visible to the outside world, but that invisibility was the point. Systems that everyone relied on and no one thought about, until they stopped working. The engineers who understood that distinction were the ones who stayed, and the ones who stayed longest were, almost without exception, the ones who had built something they could not easily replicate elsewhere. The event that the company had staked its next decade on was called Project Meridian, an integrated platform combining autonomous vehicle coordination technology with a commercial, augmented reality interface, jointly valued at $7 billion at the time of its projected launch. Partners from 3 continents had signed letters of intent. Federal regulators had completed an early-stage review. The financial press had described it, without much exaggeration, as the most significant product release in Apex's history. 3 years of engineering work, hundreds of millions in development capital, and one specific week in early spring when everything was supposed to come together in a live, global demonstration. The mood inside the building in the days leading up to that week was something between excitement and controlled panic, the particular atmosphere that forms when a very large number of people are simultaneously aware that there is no margin for error and that the margin for error has already been spent. Sebastian Cole was not someone you would notice in a company of 12,000. He held no management title. He did not attend executive strategy sessions or present to the board of directors. He occupied a workstation on the 14th floor that was, by most visible measures, indistinguishable from the 37 others arranged around it, the same dual monitors, the same ergonomic chair, the same institutional gray carpet underfoot. What was different was what lived inside his machines. Over 4 years, Sebastian had designed the core architecture of the systems that made Project Meridian possible, writing code and building frameworks that the rest of the engineering department had come to treat less as software and more as terrain, something to navigate around and work within, not something to question. No single document fully described how everything connected. No team meeting had ever begun with Sebastian walking colleagues through the system from end to end, because the system had never given anyone a reason to ask. It ran, and that was enough until it wasn't. Caleb Marsh had worked alongside Sebastian for 2 of those 4 years and understood better than most how to interpret the specific texture of Sebastian's silences. He once described his colleague to a new hire as the kind of engineer who would rather fix the problem than spend time explaining that the problem exists. He meant it as a compliment. He would think about that description often in the months that followed. Lucas Avery led the cybersecurity division at Apex with the particular temperament of someone who had spent 12 years preparing for a crisis that most of the people around him refused to take seriously. He kept meticulous logs. He ran stress simulations during off hours. In the previous 18 months, he had written 3 separate internal memos detailing a vulnerability pattern in a system update. Memos that had been read, acknowledged, and filed without action. He was not surprised by what happened on Sunday night. He was only surprised by how severe it became before it was stopped. Eleanor Harmon had arrived at Apex Dynamics under circumstances that made her position harder in ways that were difficult to explain without sounding like an excuse. Her father, Joseph Harmon, had served as chairman and acting CEO for 11 years before a cardiac episode forced him to step back from daily operations without warning. Eleanor was 32. She held an MBA from Wharton, a background in financial strategy, and the kind of composed self-assurance that develops in people who have spent their careers being underestimated. She also had no experience running a technology company. The internal discussion about her appointment moved through the building quickly in the days after. The announcement, not malicious, but honest, the way engineers tend to assess an unknown variable entering a known system. Eleanor was aware of that discussion. She had expected it. And the awareness of it shaped every decision she made from the moment she sat down at her father's desk. The security camera on the 14th floor recorded Sebastian still at his workstation at 11 o'clock on Sunday night, at the exact hour Eleanor was signing her formal appointment documents on the 22nd floor above him. 11:18 Sunday evening. The first alert arrived on Lucas's secondary monitor, a pattern recognition flag buried in the network traffic logs that most automated systems would have dismissed as noise. Lucas did not dismiss it. He pulled the full log sequence, ran a comparison against known attack signatures, and felt the specific kind of stillness that settles over a person when something they have been warning about for a long time finally arrives. The flag was not a false positive. Someone was probing the outer edge of the Meridian data infrastructure, and the probe was sophisticated enough that it had already bypassed 2 of the system's 4 outer monitoring layers before triggering a single alert. The approach was patient, deliberate, and clearly familiar with how the architecture was organized, which meant whoever had designed the attack had done research. Lucas called Sebastian at 11:29. Not because the incident response protocol listed Sebastian's name at the top of an emergency contact sheet. He called Sebastian because 12 years in cybersecurity had taught him the difference between problems a team could solve and problems that required a specific person, and what was appearing on his screens was unmistakably the second kind. Sebastian answered after 2 rings. Lucas gave him a single sentence of context. Sebastian said he would be there in 15 minutes. He arrived in 11. He looked at the primary display for approximately 45 seconds without speaking. Then he sat down at an open terminal, typed a sequence of commands Lucas did not recognize, and said in a tone of complete evenness, "This is a layered chain attack. They used the vulnerability from the March update. I flagged this 8 weeks ago." He did not say it with satisfaction or resentment. He said it the way a surgeon names a complication they predicted, not to claim credit, but because naming it accurately was the first step towards stopping it. The room around him was quiet except for the low hum of cooling fans and the occasional clatter of a keyboard from the security team members already on site. What followed was not dramatic in any cinematic sense. There was no single moment of triumph, no sudden reversal. It was methodical, sustained, and exhausting work, the kind that looks, from the outside, like a person sitting motionless in front of a monitor for hours, barely speaking, barely moving, while the weight of what he is doing remains entirely invisible to any observer who does not know what they are watching. The attack was targeting the data infrastructure connected to 4.3 million beta test users enrolled in the Meridian platform. 3 of the system's firewall layers had been breached before Sebastian arrived. The attack was running in parallel threads, probing multiple access points simultaneously, and its structure suggested not a casual intruder but an organized, well-resourced adversary, coordinated, and specifically aware of Apex's architectural patterns. Sebastian worked through the first breach vector by 1 in the morning. By 3, he had mapped the central command and control pattern and begun the methodical process of severing it. Caleb arrived sometime around 2, having seen the security alert cascade on his phone, and sat near the window without speaking. He understood enough to know that interrupting would cost time, and time was the only resource Sebastian did not have to spare. Lucas managed the external response and documentation on adjacent terminals, coordinating with off-site team members, updating internal logs, and drafting preliminary stakeholder notifications that he hoped would never need to be sent. Neither man asked Sebastian to explain what he was doing. They watched the system logs scrolling on their screens and understood that the numbers moving in the right direction meant things were, for the moment, still under control. At 5 in the morning, a second attack wave came through a vector that had not appeared in the initial probe, an access pathway the attacker had clearly held in reserve, deploying it only after the first approach was neutralized. Sebastian caught it within 4 minutes. He had in fact anticipated it, writing a specific response protocol into the code at 2:47, nearly 2.25 hours before the second wave appeared, because the structure of the first wave had told him it was coming. Lucas read the timestamp on that entry later and sat with the number for a long time. 6:40, Sebastian executed the final command. The attack was sealed. No data had been exfiltrated, no files had been encrypted or held for ransom. No user records had been exposed. The infrastructure was intact, and Project Meridian's launch timeline was unaffected. The estimated financial cost of a successful breach, based on the specific data categories that had been targeted, the regulatory exposure that would have followed, and the partner contracts that contained data security clauses, was somewhere between $340 million and $480 million. Sebastian had prevented all of it in approximately 7 hours and 20 minutes of uninterrupted work. He leaned back in the chair, his eyes closed. His hands rested near the keyboard for a moment and then went still. He did not say anything. There was nothing left to say. Lucas began the incident report immediately, documenting the nature of the attack, the response timeline, and the outcome with the detail his position required. He submitted it at 7:12 in the morning through the standard reporting channel, a channel that routed to the Vice President of Engineering, who was currently traveling in Germany and had not opened his email since the previous evening. The report sat in an unread inbox as the building below began to fill with employees arriving for the most consequential week in the company's history. Eleanor had been at her desk since 6:30. She had reviewed the launch timeline, cleared her calendar for the next 5 days, and asked her assistant to schedule a full-floor walkthrough as part of her first-week orientation, an effort to show herself present in parts of the building that executives at Apex rarely visited. The 14th floor, home to Core Systems Engineering, was on the list. She arrived there at 8:47 with Hannah Reed, the head of Human Resources, and 2 assistants trailing behind her. The first thing she saw when she stepped through the glass doors was Sebastian. He was slumped forward over his keyboard at a workstation near the center of the room, head resting on his forearms surrounded by glowing monitors. The posture was unmistakable. The room around him was in the careful, particular silence that forms when a group of people are all simultaneously pretending not to be watching something. Eleanor stopped walking. She looked at the sleeping figure, then at the monitors, then at the engineers seated nearby, all of whom had found something extremely important to study on their own screens. She did not raise her voice. She turned to the nearest person standing within arm's reach and asked, with controlled precision, "Who is that? And how long has he been like that?" The engineer she addressed, a junior member of the systems team who had arrived 20 minutes earlier and knew only fragments of the previous night, gave, his name is Sebastian Cole, said something unclear about overnight work, and immediately looked to Caleb for help. Eleanor did not redirect her attention to Caleb, she was already moving. Sebastian woke to the sound of a conversation happening above and around him, the particular quality of words being chosen carefully in a tense room. He lifted his head, his eyes were dark-rimmed and slow to focus. His hair had pressed itself into an asymmetric shape against the side of his arm. He looked at the woman in the gray suit standing 3 feet away, noted the 2 people slightly behind her with the posture of people who take notes for a living, and understood the situation in approximately the time it took him to sit fully upright. He did not apologize, he did not begin explaining immediately. He said, in a voice that was calm and slightly rough from hours without water, "I was working through the night. If you need context, Lucas Avery can walk you through the incident report." Eleanor's expression did not change. She looked at Hannah. Hannah checked her phone, the standard dashboard, the top-line system status, and found no flagged events. The incident report, still unread in the Vice President's inbox, did not surface. "System logs show no critical events overnight," Hannah said. Eleanor looked back at Sebastian. "Then it appears there was no emergency requiring you to sleep at your desk during working hours," she said. Sebastian held her gaze for a moment. "The report exists," he said. "You should read it before drawing conclusions." Eleanor's posture did not shift. "I appreciate the suggestion," she said. "Please come with me." The room the conversation moved to was a small, glass-walled conference space off the main floor, visible to the entire 14th floor, though the audio did not carry through the partition. Hannah and one assistant came in. The others waited outside. Eleanor stood. Sebastian sat because sitting was the only thing his body was currently willing to negotiate on. She laid out her position with the methodical clarity of someone who had rehearsed being clear when other people expected her to be uncertain. The company was entering the highest stakes week it had faced in its history. The standard for professional conduct during that period was absolute. No individual, regardless of seniority or tenure, was exempt from the baseline expectation of presence and accountability during work hours. She was not interested in the circumstances of the previous night, she said, because the visible outcome, a senior engineer asleep at his workstation on a Monday morning, was itself the issue. Sebastian asked quietly whether she had read the security incident report filed at 7:12 that morning. Eleanor looked at Hannah. Hannah checked again, this time more carefully, and found the email from Lucas in the vice president's unread queue. She opened it. "Read the subject line, Security Incident Report Resolved." She looked up and gave a small shake of her head that communicated, without words, "Resolved." No action needed. Eleanor turned back to Sebastian. "The incident was resolved," she said. "Which means the system is stable." She paused. "You did not need to remain here." Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was not anger. It was closer to the look of someone watching a slow and preventable mistake unfold from the wrong side of a glass wall. He said, "You are making this decision without knowing what you are about to lose." Eleanor's response was quiet and final. "I know enough." Hannah placed the termination document on the table. It had been prepared during the 3 minutes Eleanor spent framing her reasoning, quickly, efficiently, as HR directors at large companies learn to operate in situations where leadership has already made up its mind. Sebastian looked at the paper. He read it. He signed where indicated. He stood, collected the lightweight canvas bag from the back of the chair, and lifted his jacket from the hook beside the door. He did not look at the people still watching through the glass. He did not look at Caleb, who was standing near the window with his arms crossed and an expression that had stopped trying to be neutral. Sebastian walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. The doors opened. He stepped in. On the lobby level, the events team was stringing a promotional banner across the atrium ceiling, silver lettering on a dark background, the Meridian logo, the launch date. Sebastian walked beneath it without slowing and pushed through the revolving door into the March air. By 9:23, he was gone. Logan Pierce had been trying to hire Sebastian Cole for 2 years. He had made 2 formal offers, both of which Sebastian had declined without hostility. He simply had not been ready to leave. And Logan, who understood the difference between an engineer who wanted more money and one who needed a different kind of space to work in, had been patient. He heard about the termination through a contact at Apex within hours of it happening. He did not call immediately. He waited until the following afternoon, then sent a text that said only, "Coffee tomorrow if you're free." Sebastian replied 10 o'clock. They met at a small place on the west side of the city, not the kind of restaurant where business deals are announced, but the kind where conversations can last as long as they need to. Logan put a single sheet of paper on the table about 20 minutes into the conversation. It was not a contract. It was an outline, full architectural authority over Novatech's core systems, no committee approval required for technical decisions, no mandatory attendance at any meeting not directly related to the work. "I don't need you to manage anyone," Logan said. "I need you to build something." Sebastian read the page. He folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket. He said he would think about it. He called Logan 48 hours later and said yes. He began at Novatech on a Wednesday. He did not announce his arrival. He walked in, found the workstation that had been prepared for him, sat down, and spent the first 4 hours reading every piece of documentation the current systems team had produced. By the end of the first week, he had identified 17 structural issues in the existing architecture and written a priority sequence for addressing them. By the end of the second week, he had begun recruiting not from job boards, but from the specific corners of the engineering world where people who think differently tend to congregate. He was looking for a particular kind of mind. People who asked the question before the question, who saw the shape of a problem before it fully formed. He found 7 of them in 6 weeks. Together, they were small enough to move fast and precise enough not to break things in the process. For the first time in 4 years, Sebastian was building without an invisible ceiling. Meanwhile, the absence he had left behind at Apex Dynamics did not announce itself all at once. It arrived the way structural failures tend to, not in a single collapse but in a sequence of small signs that, taken individually, could each be explained away. The first visible signal came 6 days after Sebastian's departure. Caleb Marsh submitted his resignation. He gave 2 weeks' notice and offered Hannah a reason that was technically accurate. He had received an outside opportunity, without mentioning the more fundamental truth, which was that he had looked at the systems he was responsible for maintaining and understood, with the precision of someone who had watched their architect leave, that he no longer had confidence in his ability to fix them when they broke. 2 other engineers from the 14th floor followed within the next 9 days. Then a 4th, then a 5th. Each resignation was processed with the standard language of attrition, and each was reported to Eleanor as a manageable staffing adjustment in a period of natural turnover. The technical problems were subtler at first but more consequential. The systems Sebastian had built were layered with internal logic that existed, in many cases, only in his understanding, not because he had been secretive, but because the problems those layers addressed had been discovered iteratively, solved in the moment, and never translated into documentation that could outlast his presence. When the new engineering team hired to backfill the 14th floor encountered these layers, they approached them the way any experienced engineer approaches unfamiliar code, with reasonable caution and established methodology. The methods worked cleanly on code that had been written with documentation in mind. They produced unpredictable results on code that had been written by a person who was always solving the next problem while appearing to solve the current one. Each patch generated new fault lines. Each correction introduced new variables. The system remained functional, technically, by every standard test, but it was becoming less stable in ways that the standard tests were not designed to catch, because the tests had been written to assess the system's visible behavior, not the invisible load-bearing relationships between its components. One junior engineer, working late one evening on the integration layer between the autonomous coordination engine and the augmented reality renderer, came across a section of code she could not interpret. She spent an hour annotating it and then flagged it to her team lead with a note that read, "Unknown dependency pattern, possibly legacy. Do not modify without deeper review." The flag was added to the backlog. In the 3 weeks before the launch, the backlog was not reviewed. Eleanor received weekly updates that described a project slightly behind schedule due to integration challenges. She responded to each update the way her training had prepared her. Additional resources, tightened deadlines, daily status calls. She did not know what she did not know. In one late afternoon meeting with her senior team, someone asked whether it would be worth reaching out to Sebastian Cole, framed carefully, professionally, as a resource consultation rather than a reconsideration of his departure. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked through the window at the city below and said, "We don't need to go that far." No one asked again. The day of the global launch arrived on a Tuesday in April. The venue was a converted event space in Chicago's South Loop, arranged with the precise attention to detail that very large technology events require. Lighting calibrated for broadcast, the seating arranged for the cameras, the demo equipment configured and tested and configured again. More than 200 journalists had confirmed attendance. 43 partner organizations had sent delegations. Investors from 6 countries were watching the live stream from offices across 3 time zones. Eleanor had spent the previous 6 weeks in the kind of preparation that eliminates the possibility of relaxation. Every presentation element reviewed, every contingency addressed, every sentence of her keynote refined until it said exactly what she meant in exactly the order she wanted it heard. She walked on stage at 10:12 to sustained applause. She was composed, precise, and visibly ready. The first 15 minutes of the presentation were flawless. The financial case for Meridian was compelling. The partnership announcements drew genuine response from the room. And then the product demonstration began. The autonomous coordination sequence launched cleanly. The first 90 seconds played exactly as scripted, the vehicle platform responding to directional inputs, the augmented reality overlay rendering the environmental data in real time, the entire system performing with the smooth authority of something that had been built carefully and tested thoroughly. And then at the 93-second mark the display froze. The back-of-house technical team saw it happen simultaneously on 4 monitors. The system had encountered a fault in the integration layer between the vehicle coordination engine and the AR rendering pipeline, a fault that had been invisible in all prior testing because it only manifested under the specific combination of load conditions that a live global broadcast created. The fault itself had been introduced 6 weeks earlier by a patch that had corrected one problem while silently weakening a dependency connection that Sebastian had built to handle precisely this kind of peak load scenario. The patch had passed every test. The dependency connection it weakened had not been in any test specification, because no test specification had ever included it, because no test specification had ever been written with Sebastian's full architectural knowledge. The back-of-house team attempted a restart. The system returned an error sequence that no one in the room recognized. A second restart attempt produced a different error. A third attempt produced a cascade that began propagating through adjacent system components. By the time the team lead made the decision to isolate and halt rather than continue attempting recovery, 14 minutes had elapsed since the freeze. Eleanor stood at the podium for those 14 minutes and continued speaking. She transitioned to discussion of future roadmap, referenced partner capabilities, acknowledged the technical interruption with the kind of smooth composure that looks, from a camera angle, like confidence. The people in the room knew better. The screens behind her remained dark. At 10:41, the event was officially suspended pending a technical resolution with no announced time frame. By 11 o'clock, the first wire service had published a breaking news item. By 11:17, the company's stock had dropped 11%. By 11:45, the first partner organization had issued a statement announcing a temporary suspension of its Meridian commitment pending further assessment. At 1 in the afternoon, the Securities and Exchange Commission requested a formal explanation of the disruption's cause and scope. At 3, the board of directors convened an emergency session that Eleanor attended via secure video link from a back room in the event venue, still in the white jacket she had worn on stage. In that room, before the board call began, she was alone for 6 minutes. She sat at a small table with her phone face down and looked at the wall. 47 missed calls had accumulated on the screen she had chosen not to look at. One text notification was visible from her father. The message read, "Eleanor, call me now." The independent audit commissioned by the board took 11 days. The firm Eleanor's team engaged was experienced in technology infrastructure reviews, and they approached the Apex systems with the same methodology they applied to every engagement. Tracing the chain of events backward from the failure point, identifying each intervention, and documenting its effect on system behavior. The chain led step by step to a series of patches applied over a 6-week period. Each patch had been applied by qualified engineers using sound methodology. Each had been tested and approved, and each had, in some small degree, destabilized something in the underlying architecture that the patching engineers had not known to account for, because what they had not known was what the architecture was actually doing at layers they had never been shown. The audit team identified the origin point of the instability. The first patch applied after the departure of the system's primary architect. The date was on the report. The name above it was also on the report. The board read both. The final summary page of the audit included a data table that no one in the room commented on immediately after it was distributed. It listed 4 numbers in 2 columns. The estimated financial exposure of the cyber attack that had been prevented, between $340 million and $480 million, alongside the confirmed financial damage of the launch failure, which had erased more than $1.1 billion in market capitalization in the first week alone, with ongoing partner contract renegotiations projected to add further costs in the months ahead. Below the table, in a single sentence written with the precise caution of people who had learned to be exact about things that were not their decision to judge, the auditors had noted. Both figures traced directly to events involving the same individual on the same date. Lucas Avery was called into a formal interview on the fourth day of the audit. For the first time since the Sunday night attack, the incident report he had filed at 7:12 in the morning was read aloud in full, not just the subject line, not just the status field, but every paragraph, including the section detailing the attack's scope, the data at risk, and the estimated cost of a successful breach. The room was quiet for nearly a minute after the reading concluded. One board member asked Lucas how long Sebastian had worked without stopping. Lucas checked his log and answered, 38.5 hours, beginning with his shift the previous day and ending when the attack was sealed. Eleanor requested a private viewing of the security camera footage from the 14th floor for the window between 11 at night and 7 in the morning on the night of the attack. She sat in a small room with a monitor and watched it alone. She watched Sebastian arrive. She watched him work. She watched the timestamps on the system logs scrolling in the corner of the secondary display. 1:47, 2:15, 3:03, 4:28, and she understood, watching the numbers change, that each timestamp represented a specific problem encountered and solved, a specific disaster that did not happen. She watched him execute the final command. She watched his hands go still. She watched him close his eyes. And then she watched herself walk into the room 2 hours later and make a decision in 30 seconds. She paused the footage, she rewound it, she watched it again. At the end of the board's formal review session, one director asked the technical lead whether it was possible to reconstruct the system's core architecture without Sebastian. The engineer who answered took a long pause before speaking, then he said, "Technically, yes. With approximately 18 months of development time, $200 million in engineering resources, and a clear understanding of what we are trying to reproduce." He paused again. That last part is the hardest part. Eleanor drove to Novatech on a Thursday morning in early May. She told no one in advance. She brought no assistant, no legal counsel, no prepared document package. She wore a coat she had bought years before the Apex appointment, a dark wool one that did not read as executive, and she arrived at the Novatech lobby at 9:50 and told the receptionist she was there to see Sebastian Cole. She did not give her company name. She gave her first and last name and said she did not have an appointment. She sat in the lobby for 40 minutes. Sebastian appeared in the hallway that connected the lobby to the interior offices, carrying a laptop under one arm. He stopped when he saw her. He stood very still for a moment, the way a person stands when they are deciding something, and then he nodded once, slowly, and gestured toward a meeting room off the main corridor. The room had a round table with 4 chairs. Eleanor sat in one. Sebastian sat across from her, laptop set aside, hands resting on the table. He waited. She said, "I'm sorry." She said it without preamble, without a sentence of context setting before it, because she had decided in the car that the sentence needed to be the first thing she said and not something she arrived at after explaining herself. Sebastian did not respond immediately. He looked at her across the table with an expression that was attentive and unreadable. She told him what the audit had found. She told him what she had seen on the security footage. She told him the estimated cost of the breach he had prevented, and the confirmed cost of the launch failure that had followed his departure, and she did not frame any of it as an argument or a case to be made. She simply described what was true. Sebastian listened without interrupting, without adjusting his posture, without any visible indication of what he was thinking. Then she placed an envelope on the table between them. Inside was a formal offer, Chief Technology Officer of Apex Dynamics, with full authority over all technical systems and development direction, terms negotiable at Sebastian's discretion, and an unambiguous reporting structure that placed all engineering decisions outside the reach of non-technical review. Sebastian looked at the envelope. He did not pick it up. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked back at Eleanor. "Are you asking me this because you need me?" he said, "or because you believe it is the right thing to do?" Eleanor held his gaze. She was quiet for long enough that the answer was clearly not one she had prepared. Then she said, "It started as the first. After the footage, I think it's both." Sebastian nodded slightly. "That's an honest answer." Then he reached across the table and pushed the envelope back to her side. Gently and without hesitation. "I can't come back," he said, "not because of what happened. Because I'm somewhere I should be." Eleanor did not argue. She had known, driving over, that this was the probable outcome, and she had come anyway because she believed she owed him the directness of a face-to-face conversation more than she believed it would succeed. She nodded once and began to stand. Before she reached the door, Sebastian said one more thing, and he said it in the same even, unhurried voice he had used in every conversation she had witnessed him have. "The next time you see someone asleep at their desk, ask one question before you decide what it means. Just one." She did not answer. She pulled the door open and she left. 6 months passed. At Novatech, Sebastian's team released a technical white paper on distributed systems architecture for next-generation autonomous infrastructure. It did not make headlines in the consumer press. Inside the engineering community, it moved quickly. Within 3 weeks of publication, it had been cited in 12 independent research contexts and adopted as a reference document by 2 federal transportation technology working groups. Sebastian did not speak at any conferences about it. He did not give interviews. The work spoke in its own register, to the people whose job it was to listen to that kind of language, and that was sufficient. Caleb Marsh was part of the team that wrote 2 of the paper's technical appendices. He had joined Novatech 6 weeks after leaving Apex, and he had settled into the work with the particular relief of someone who has returned to a version of a job they had forgotten they loved. He never discussed Apex in team meetings, but occasionally, when a newer engineer raised a question about a judgment call, whether to document a workaround, whether to flag a dependency that might not matter, whether to slow down in order to build something that would hold, Caleb would tell a story. He never used names. He never needed to. Apex Dynamics completed its system rebuild in 14 months at a cost marginally above auditor's original estimate. The company returned to operational stability and relaunched a scaled-down version of Project Meridian the following year. Eleanor remained as CEO throughout the restructuring. She brought in an experienced chief technology officer from the outside and, by every account from the engineering teams who worked with her afterward, she had developed a particular habit that she had not possessed before. She asked questions before she drew conclusions, and she waited for complete answers before she moved. On a Tuesday evening in late autumn, Eleanor was working late in her office when a new email appeared in her inbox. There was no subject line, there was no opening sentence, there was no signature beyond a name. Attached to the message was a research paper published in the IEEE Transactions Journal on Distributed Systems, authored by Sebastian Cole, detailing an architectural framework for fault-tolerant infrastructure under adversarial conditions. Eleanor read the paper from the first page to the last. It took her 1 hour and 35 minutes. She printed it out when she was done, went through it a second time with a pen, and underlined 3 passages that she found particularly precise. Then she set the pages down on her desk and looked at the window for a long time. She did not send a reply that night. There are decisions made in 30 seconds that take years to fully understand. They are not made from cruelty most of the time or from malice. They are made from incomplete information and the urgent, human need to appear certain in a moment that feels like it is asking for certainty. The weight of a decision like that does not declare itself when it is made. It arrives later in the silence after a system fails, in the footage from a camera that recorded something no one thought to ask about, in a research paper that arrives without explanation from a person who has already moved on and has nothing left to prove. What separates the leaders who grow from those who don't is not whether they made the mistake. Almost everyone makes the mistake. It is whether, when the full picture finally came into focus, they were willing to look at it without looking away, and whether the looking changed anything at all about how they saw the next person standing in front of them.